Good evening, everyone. Just give a second for those that are here to join us tonight at this amazing SeaTalk. It's actually my first chance to be a moderator of a SeaTalk. For many years now, I've been coming to SeaTalks on Saturna, looking at them at the hall. So I'm really glad that we have a chance to maybe connect with you guys tonight, even though you're in your home communities and in your homes watching this talk. So we're a minute in, so I guess we'll get started. My name is Martin Anovich, and I am acting as the Director of Education for SEMRIS tonight. I'm really excited to bring to you this SeaTalk with some SEEC students, which is my other hat on the island as the teacher of the Saturna Ecological Education Center in SD64. And we also have our presenter, Jeff Marliave from Oceanwise and Marliave, excuse me, who is a renowned scientist in rockfish, glass sponges, and climate change solutions in RC around these regions. So we will have two presenters tonight. First is a class of grade 12 students who are kind of doing this as their final presentation on a citizen science project as a capstone presentation to their community about some of the things that they've been working on over the last 6 months at SEEC in SD64. So with that being said, I'll start off by turning it over to Salish Patel to start. And I'd just like, again, to thank you all for making some time and space to learn with us tonight about rockfish.
Before we start our presentation, we would like to acknowledge that from where we are presenting is the traditional unceded land of the many Coast Salish peoples. We are so grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn from this beautiful island called Saturna. So who are we? Saturna Ecological Education Center is an SD64 outdoor semi-boarding school comprised of a small groups of grades 10 to 12. We come from all around the lower mainland or the surrounding islands to join on Saturna from Sunday night to Wednesday night. We live off-grid on Priscilla Eubank's property in these unique cabins designed by Richard Blagborn. SEEC is a place-based, hands-on school focused on environmental studies.
I'm Graham, and I guess this is the first slide on rockfish. What makes rockfish important? Well, rockfish are not only fascinating and diverse creatures, but they're also important to nearshore and offshore ecosystems. There have been 37 species of rockfish caught in BC, of which 4 have been listed as endangered. All these species are long-lived, with most having lifespans up to 50, but some, like yellow eye, can live upwards of 100 years, with some of the offshore variety, like rough eye, living over 200 years old. Long reefs, species like tiger, china, and quillback rockfish are very territorial and live in packs, not too different from wolf packs. These fish are very important predators and are essential to maintain the carrying capacity of smaller fish in local ecosystems in the Coast Salish Sea. And here are the 4 species of rockfish that have been listed as endangered. They are yellow eye, quillback, tiger, and copper. Rockfish, which you can buy and eat, is often sold as red snapper. They're not red snapper. Red snappers are only found off the coast of Florida, and that's what they look like there. Yeah, the next slide. Why they're endangered in the Salish Sea? Well, rockfish are slow-growing fish and do not reach sexual maturity until 20, sometimes even as late as 30 years old. This means that they reproduce very slowly compared to other fish, making it hard to recover from commercial fishing and other factors that contribute to the destruction of their habitat. Seafloor trawling is a large reason for their declining population of rockfish in the Salish Sea, but where trawling is not allowed, sport fishing is just as destructive to the population. Rockfish also suffer from habitat loss as trawling destroys their primary habitat. The top right picture is the picture before and after seafloor trawling.
My name is Kath, and I'll be speaking a bit more on why rockfish are endangered. When you are reeling a rockfish in, It is not able to adapt fast enough to change in pressure, much like a diver ascending from the depths. So when the rockfish reaches the surface, its swim bladder expands and knocks the fish out. Most people, when they catch a fish too small or on the endangered list, they throw it back in. But with rockfish, this is the opposite of what you're supposed to do. This is why the BC Fish and Wildlife Department made it mandatory to have a descender device while fishing in BC waters. The bottom left picture shows a rockfish with its swim bladder expanded, pushing its stomach out of its mouth. The top right picture is an example of one of many types of descender devices that can be used to save rockfish. They're very easy to use and are 95% effective. These fish are generally caught in waters ranging from 50 to 100 meters deep. This can cause their swim bladder to increase tenfold until it pushes their stomach out of their mouth and causes their eyes to bulge. Rockfish, shockingly, can live up to 100 years old, which is one of the longest lifespans of fish. Each ring on the ear bone represents 1 year of age. This is how you would tell the age of all types of fish. As you can see by the chart, rockfish are very unique considering how old they have to be before they can actually start to reproduce. However, that is one of the main reasons the growth rate for the rockfish population is so slow. Rockfish conservation zones are areas located in the Salish Sea where all types of hook and line fishing is banned to help protect the habitats of our local rockfish. They are protected by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, who have put up signs to make people aware that there is no fishing in the areas, although they can't regularly enforce this. The sign on the left was made by Cedar Lopateki, one of the SEEC students, to hopefully be put at Winter Cove on Saturna to show where the Rockfish Conservation Zone is around the Belchain Islets. The picture on the right is taken from DFO's website to show all the rockfish conservation zones that are in the Gulf Islands.
Hi there, my name is Clara. I'm going to be talking a bit about how we got involved, and a bit about our cameras. So we are lucky to have Martin, a teacher who looks out for citizen science opportunities for us, hands-on opportunities, and he found this rockfish conservation project that the Galliano Conservancy was working on. And as he works with Simries, who was also keen on this project, it seemed like, and we both have similar interests. We care a lot about this sea and protecting it. It seemed like a very natural partnership opportunity for us to do. So we have been working on it, though the cameras originally came from the Galliano Conservancy, who have been working on it since 2014. And they have seen a major decrease in fishing in the Rockfish Conservation Areas around Galliano. They've done a lot of work on it. They've put up 42 signs around the Gulf Islands. You can see here on the top right is a sign which is at Lisle Harbor on Saturna. And standing there is Sarah, who was one of the summer students at the Galliano Conservancy, who came over in September and gave us cameras, gave us a presentation on rockfish, told us how to run the project here that they were doing there. So we're excited to be helping these fish. These cameras are set up overlooking the 2 conservation zones surrounding Saturna. So we have one on Richard and Nancy's property overlooking the Java Islets, which is that the northern dot there. And we have one overlooking the Belchain Islets on Colleen Morey's property. We thank them both for the space they offer. And Colleen Morey's property is right next to Russell Reef. So that's where that one is. These cameras these trail cameras are programmed to take a picture every 5 minutes. And we collect the pictures every 2 to 3 weeks. And we flip through them looking for fishing because it's illegal to do any fishing in those zones. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to Peter.
Hello, my name is Peter. I'm a SEEC student. So our method, after receiving all the photos from the cameras, we have to do a lot of processing and a lot of data work. When looking through the photos, we are looking for any boat that is in more than 3 frames. So I guess that's 15 minutes. So if there are boats in the conservation zone for 15 minutes, that's a suspected fishing. If the boat is traveling through the frame and is not idling, then we would consider that a transiting. And if the boat is, if we can actually see any fishing gear on the boat, then we would consider that a confirmed fishing. So these next slides, I'll be showing you what transiting looks like. Through all the photos, we see a lot of boats just passing through the conservation zone, but not a lot of them are doing the illegal fishing. So that's just a transiting boat. As you can see, it is not idling and is not in there in the more than 3 frames. So that's a transiting. Suspected fishing. The next 4 pictures are examples of what illegal fishing in the Salish Sea and the Java Islets look like. You will see that the next slides, the boat is circling the islets and not moving, passing them. This is how we can tell if the person is fishing. So this boat is just circling the Java islets. And that what would be considered a suspected fishing. What we found in the past 5 months, we have had a lot of data collection between the Beltane and the Java Islets. We have only found 2 incidents of suspected fishing, both in the Java Islets. Our data is from September to March, excluding December and January. These incidents were only during September, which is closer to the prime time of fishing. The rest of the year up until March, we found no suspected fishing. This is a good sign, but it doesn't necessarily confirm that the Galliano and other outreach work has been effective, due to the fact that our data is from the off season. We are hoping that our outreach will help deter people from fishing in the conservation zones and the Salish Sea.
All right, so a major part of helping rockfish is outreach. So far, we have spread the word about rockfish through Facebook, the Driftwood, and the Scribbler. We posted a guessing game on Facebook just to get people thinking, and a few people guessed correctly on our guessing game, and the image there was boat fishing in a Rockfish Conservation Area. And we contacted and were interviewed by the Driftwood's Elizabeth Nolan, who wrote an article about our efforts. And the poster that was featured earlier, made by one of our students, was also posted in the Scribbler. So what can you do to help? If you fish, you should check the DFO's website regulations before you go fishing and learn where your local RCAs are. And if you don't fish, you can help spread the word about rockfish. And if you see anyone illegally fishing, you should report it to the line featured there. Overall, our class has really enjoyed learning by doing real hands-on science. It has been very valuable to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, work that actually means something. We're all very grateful for this experience. So thank you to Galliano for engaging with us to be a part of this. And thank you to Simries for buying us the trail cameras so that we can continue to conduct this experiment. Thanks.
I believe there was one or two other people that we just wanted to mention. Saturna Foundation also helped us in a grant purchase these cameras to be able to do this work. And also SD64 allows us to have a program like SEEC, which is really awesome that the kids can come to an island and engage in a little bit of learning that's hands-on and out in the fields to find out what science is all about. So if you do have any questions in the question and answer at the bottom of your screen, it's a really great place to put those. I'll be moderating those throughout. And we will just let both of our presenters present before. So if there's anything that does come up for you, feel free to drop them down in the question and answer. With that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Marliave, who is a senior research scientist, an expert in rockfish and glass sponge reefs and climate change effects on marine species. He was the head of the Howe Sound Research and Conservation for many years and is familiar with rockfish conservation efforts on the West Coast. We greatly look forward to hearing his expert opinion, building on our introduction to this lovely species.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to talk about the intersection of rockfish conservation areas with glass sponge reef closures in Howe Sound. Howe Sound is bordering on the Strait of Georgia the same way that Saturna Island has the inland sea of the South Gulf Islands and the offshore of the Strait of Georgia. Glass sponge reefs for the South Gulf Islands are all off the Gabriola Ridge in the Strait of Georgia. So back when DFO was first forming rockfish conservation areas, the Howe Sound research program staff did lots of rockfish surveys to present data to DFO to try and influence government decisions. And then when 164 rockfish conservation areas were established in 2007, we started a citizen science program for people downloading their dive observations for either baby, juvenile, or adult fish of the species that are being protected in rockfish conservation areas. As was said, in the rockfish conservation areas, there are 4 species that are of concern for the Strait of Georgia: the tiger rockfish, which can live upwards of like 80 years, and yellow eye rockfish, which actually goes over a century, and the quillback with the dark tail also can go for over a century. The copper rockfish only lives up to about 50 years, and those are the ones that we have in the South Gulf Islands and in Howe Sound. The important thing to know is that rockfish give live birth every single year, but in most years, the larvae kind of crash and burn. During the last century, there were only 3 dominant fishery year classes for yellow eyes, and by chance, also only 3 dominant year classes for quillback. And a year class, just think of them allowing people to get their COVID shots, is your year of birth. So the 1917 yellow eye rockfish year class dominated fisheries catches in British Columbia for many decades, probably through the 50s. Quillbacks in different years. So people are saying now that DFO is reevaluating rockfish conservation areas, oh, well, they've been in place since 2007. It's time to open them up, time to see what we've reaped from it. And actually, no, you know, I may not live long enough to see another big yellow eye rockfish year class. So across all of British Columbia, there are actually 6 species. The China rockfish is only out on the outer coast. It's very closely related to copper and quillback. Yeah. The black rockfish was originally being included, but it's kind of an embarrassment to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans because it's super abundant on the outer coast, yet it's been greatly reduced in the Strait of Georgia. And I'll be talking about this because in Vancouver Harbor, Burrard Inlet, and Howe Sound, it's actually been extirpated. That means driven locally extinct. This slide, I was saying, this is the China rockfish, which is closely related to the others. Then this is where I was about the increase in size of copper rockfish. So White Cliff Park was actually set aside as a marine protected area in the 1990s, before the Rockfish Conservation Area program. Back in the 1980s, when anybody could fish for rockfish anywhere, anytime, the copper rockfish in White Cliff and all of Howe Sound were around 22 centimeters in length, which means very young adult, and then they were getting caught. by the time we had Rockfish Conservation Areas, and White Cliff is in the West Vancouver Rockfish Conservation Area, the age was up to 28 years average, which is a fully mature adult because this species only lives for about 50 years. So now I'm going to talk about black rockfish, which were extirpated from Howe Sound. In 1966, we collected several hundred under yearling black rockfish from Ucluelet on the west coast of the island, brought them back to the aquarium. And then in 1997, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife put coated wire tags in the noses of 252 little black rockfish. And we released them between November of 97 and January of 98 at Lighthouse Park. And so this yellow dashed area here was a 1998 fisheries research fishing closure. And this is, depending on where you call the shoreline, 80 meters offshore and 100 meters in the longshore. And the beauty of this site is that it's a reef that was famous for people catching black rockfish, very deep rocky reefs, only 30 meters offshore, moving 100 meters offshore, the rockfish can get from 10 meters depth to 55 meters depth. Now, in California and Oregon, where a lot of black rockfish studies have taken place, it's low gradient shoreline, and rockfish have to swim a half to over a kilometer in order to go from 10 meters depth to 20 meters depth. So the living space for black rockfish down there is 6 to 10 times larger. We watched the little rockfish grow up on this reef, and during the first decade of the new millennium, we actually saw several modest year classes. The babies were growing up here as well, but they spread sort of around the corner. Then in 2004, 2005, some of the same cohort had grown to sexual maturity at the aquarium, and we put acoustic tags surgically inside them. And we between 2004 and 2007, we got over 1.5 million pings in the receivers on the two sides of this reef. And we knew that the fish were moving back and forth because the receiver here was blinded from the receiver over here by rocky pinnacles down in deep water. And the rockfish would move back and forth. And there was one that took long forays away from the site during the first few days after it was released. And for 11 months, it stayed on the reef, and then it started taking wide forays and it disappeared. So we presumed that it emigrated. But by 2010, the orange areas show you rockfish conservation areas. The lighthouse at Point Atkinson is where the release was, that little red dot right down here in West Vancouver. And the white spots, we had conducted intensive rockfish surveys and didn't see any black rockfish. The red dots are where we did see black rockfish. We only saw one individual up here on the Sea to Sky Highway, one or two, I think, over on Bowen. But we saw a large number of bird islets. And since then, the bird islets population has sexually matured, and we've had a little bit of spread up into Howe Sound. But I'm going to be saying that very few rockfish year classes occurred during this decade. Now, Boyer Island is a rockfish conservation area, and the yellow circle shows an area of cliffs, and it's northwest Boyer Island, right below the Howe Sound crest, and right on the other side of that crest is where the 2010 Olympics had that rapid snow melt that threatened the snowboarding competition. With high coastal mountains that get very heavy snowpacks, you can get a heavy rain, which puts ice water into the surface waters of Howe Sound. And the result is that the water temperature in shallow water can drop from a wintertime temperature of about 8 degrees down to 4 degrees, which for a cold-blooded vertebrate can knock the heart rate right down. In fact, in fish, there can be muscular modification of the heart during this period. So it's that cliff, it has ice heaving boulders into the water, and the rockfish get very cold when they're in here. And this shows in 2007 a copper rockfish with a 7 centimeters yellow spaghetti tag in it. The boulders here are maybe 4 or 5 layers deep, and there's another little juvenile rockfish in the lower corner. These were not mature. During the first half decade of our survey, we saw them reach sexual maturity, which we were calling 20 centimeters for an average species of rockfish for our surveys. And then from 2012 through 2019, they were all over 20 centimeters. None of them grew to over 25 centimeters. So it was a very stable population. And this again shows that embayment. And we put the yellow tags at the north end of the survey area, and then we had a 15-meter no man's land where we did no tagging, and then we put red tags on the south side. We only saw a half a dozen sightings as much as a year later, but the fish had never moved out of the area where they were tagged. And by 2009, the fish were fleeing from us when we would go up with a Hawaiian sling in this area, but in between, you could swim right up to them. They weren't afraid. So I decided this was inhumane to harass them that way, and we stopped doing it, but we kept the survey up. And this is what we got over the space of 13 years. In means you have to shine a dive light down into the boulder pile to see them, and out means they're swimming up above the rock pile, like the photo of the one with the yellow tag. And then the little fine line bars are plus or minus the standard error. The dashed line shows the proportion seen out. And you can see in the dead of winter, they're pretty well all in. You might ask yourself, well, why don't you see upwards of 200 rockfish out in the dead of, or in the dead of winter? And the answer is that during late summer, when the fish are swimming out, the ones you see inside are really only one boulder down. They're very easy to spot. They're just probably just temporarily hiding. In the dead of winter, you have to find spots where you can shine down through 2 or 3 layers of boulders, and sometimes down deep you'd see a pair of rockfish huddled together. And of course, this is where they're completely safe from the very violent Arctic outflow windstorms that are worse in La Nina winters. And it's November when they get driven into hiding, when the windstorms first start. This winter period is also the period of pregnancy for copper rockfish. And I actually was lucky in April of one year to see a small female copper upside down in the upper layer of boulders with her genital papilla pointed skyward, ready to give birth. We saw some pregnant rockfish come out of hiding pregnant, but you can see that they still aren't really out until full summer. The summer is when there are lots of little baby shiner perch. Shiner perch go down into deep water in the winter, so there's really no reason to be out foraging. Whereas big copper rockfish on deep reefs don't go into full quiescence inside rock piles, and there's much more predation opportunity down deep. On the west coast of Vancouver Island, very old small rockfish live at the heads of the inlets, whereas big young rockfish live out in the open ocean. So this may be a balanced polymorphism for this sheltering behavior. Now, the duration of winter sheltering varies, and there were 4 La Nina winters with very long hiding periods, like, most of the year, over 7 months. Only 2 winters were termed normal, according to the Ocean Nino index. And so we concluded that our rockfish were telling us that really it doesn't make much sense for most years to be either El Nino or La Nina. And this, with an anomaly of 0.74, this El Nino and these 2 La Ninas at minus 0.66, if you consider them all to be normal, if you have to have an anomaly greater than 0.8, then you wind up with 5 out of 13 years being normal, and 4 El Nino winters and 4 La Nina winters. That makes a little bit more sense. And fact is that you really have to look at the inhabitants of the ocean to tell you what they think about your indices. Sorry for this slide, but this is the ocean index Ocean Nino Index for the period we've been talking about. I just want you to see that there's a huge El Nino in 97, 98 with big anomalies, 2.1, 2.3, 2.4, and then only 2 normal months, and then a very strong La Nina. A lot of people said that the millennial climate regime shift started after all the La Ninas in 2001, but when we looked at seabed biodiversity, about uncommon species that wink out or reappear, it was actually, we're saying that 1999 was the climate regime shift. And then if you look later, 2009, 2010, there's another fairly strong El Nino followed by only 2 normal months, and then a strong La Nina that ended in 2011. So we're saying there was a climate regime shift in 2011. The significance for rockfish is Donna Gibbs and I had a dive in 2005 where we counted over 1,000 rockfish in an hour, most of them yearling quillbacks and a lot of yearling coppers and some yearling yellow eye. Lots of rockfish reproduction in the millennial climate regime. We've seen nothing in the 2011 climate regime. There was a yellowtail rockfish year class probably in 2014, but I'm going to switch horses now midstream and jump to sponge reefs. People who have been diving on sponge reefs really recently haven't seen it look like this. This is from 2007, where there were little squat lobsters all over the sponges. If you're a baby rockfish coming in to settle, this is pretty scary. These guys have real claws and would probably eat a newly settling rockfish. But if you're a juvenile growing up and you're big enough to eat squat lobsters, hey, this is a terrific resource. And so you find that quillbacks in particular move on to sponge reefs and grow out as juveniles, and then the adults live there. And it's a terrific broodstock habitat that is comparable to a boulder reef, only occur in much deeper water. This is a sponge garden. This is on Saturna Island, and this is a mosaic of photos from 2003. And I want you to know that these sponges right here, this was May of 2003, and in late May, a downrigger wire sliced all these sponges sheer to the rock. That rock is further out than any place else. And the 2009, 2010 El Nino killed off all the sponges up above this cliff top behind the diver. There's lots of sponges, and the quillbacks would just dive into the cloud sponges as you swam by. But the fact is that the feeding opportunities are from all the soft-bodied organisms that live on the rock surfaces. On a sponge bioherm, the cloud sponges are growing on the dead skeletons of previous sponges that have been stabilized by sediments. Bioherm is a sort of a nerdy jargon term, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans now calls them GSRs, glass sponge reefs. And so we've got a lot of glass sponge reef closures in Howe Sound. This just shows the difference in biodiversity between a sponge garden, and a lot of these data are from inshore Defense Island, for a sponge garden very close to the sponge reef. And in the bioherm or sponge reef, the vertebrates are the rockfishes and lingcod. Arthropods are the squat lobsters, shrimps, and crabs. And then there's one nudibranch that can eat glass sponges. There's one worm that lives on the bioherm, and then there are a few sponge species. Some sponges live on dead cloud sponge. So this is, if any of you take notes, the tiny URL will give you a free download for a book chapter on this sponge reef. And the important thing for you to realize is that they only occur in British Columbia, and the air diveable ones, as far as we know, only occur in Howe Sound. But back in the early era of dinosaurs, during the Jurassic, there was a vast area of sponge reef on shallow seabed, which later rose up and became the continent of Europe. And the mountain ranges from the Pyrenees to the Alps to the Carpathians are all the remnants of one huge glass sponge reef that was the biggest living landform in the history of life on Earth. So we've got a real heritage feature here, and this is downhill on the left is the north side of this ridge, and that's where the quillbacks live. This is from a sponge garden on the north side of Bowen Island, and this shows where a downrigger cannonball sliced through, and the fishing line just sliced it like a cheese wire. And by the end of the year, you could see this is a slightly different angle, but you're looking through the same gap, and you can see that the sponges were healing. And then a little over a year later, or no, 2 years later, in February of 2015, the part that had fallen uphill was so well healed that mittens were reaching down and cementing to the rock, and it looked terrific. But you know, another downrigger made an identical track through this spot, and that's because when a cannonball hits the rocky reef, the rocks direct the downrigger. And I'm sad to say that as of 2019, this sponge garden, the original sponges no longer exist. They've been hit too many times by downriggers. So at the Defense Sponge Reef, we had probably a number of passes by the same boat in October 2016, and it was very disorienting for the dive team because they couldn't really recognize the place. And this shows one of the divers, Laura Borden, replacing a slice of sponge back against the host tissue is cut off from. And this shows the dead sponges sedimented in that formed the base of the reef. And then she stuck a couple of PVC pipe poles to hold it in place, and just like a broken bone in a cast, it completely healed. And today the whole sponge is growing much bigger. So if there's a little help, they can grow back, but there is a real danger from downriggers damaging these glass sponges. Now, this is Howe Sound, and remember the map that showed bright orange rockfish conservation areas here? Those rockfish conservation areas are cross-hatched, and the pink areas are glass sponge reef closures. The very top of the map, that's the inshore and offshore Defense Island glass sponge reefs. DFO has the idea that they would like Canada is committed to going to 25 and now 30% of sea surface being protected. And so for Howe Sound and Howe Sound only, they're talking about trying to rationalize glass sponge reef and closures and rockfish conservation areas, maybe try and merge them. And I sent them a big long essay. These bright green outlines with the red blotches surrounded by yellow are newly ground truthed sponge reefs areas that they had side scan evidence. And the only red blotches where they didn't find healthy sponge reefs were down in this Queen Charlotte Channel area that spans the Passage Island Rockfish Conservation Area that has a very fine sponge reef in it, and the West Vancouver Rockfish Conservation Area, which also has a big sponge reef. The prawn fishermen are now calling this the dead sponge area. So got to let us fish in the dead sponge area. That's a misnomer because it's a damaged sponge reef area. I gave them big written essays on what they could do, and I was asked if I would please submit a map. So special to you, and don't tell any of my secrets. This is the map I sent into them, and there's room for all kinds of howling and fighting and biting over this, because this, I don't think, gives you 25% or 30% coverage if you consider that the Squamish Reach has no protected areas. And I'm suggesting that they just rescind the Woolridge Island RCA and the Dahmet Point RCA. I think those were originally established because nobody was complaining. But this huge area would be fantastic for rockfish and glass sponge reefs, but sport guides would they'll have fits over it. There'll be huge fits. The sport guides pushed these rockfish conservation areas into the backs of these two little embayments because they said Carmelo Point was just too important for downrigger fishing. But we've got these glass sponge reefs and then some deep rocky reefs. So you get some terrific RCAs, and these huge reefs are de facto protected by the Langdale ferry terminal. Nobody sets prawn traps where the ferries are making a big swing over top. So we'll see what happens.
So I've just been monitoring a few questions that have come up throughout. One of the questions that came up for the SEEC students is, would you continue to monitor in the future? And I'm just going to turn that over to Peter to maybe talk about that.
Will you continue?
Well, I think we will continue. I know I won't, because I'm in grade 12 and I'll be leaving next year, and I know a couple of us will, but I think this is a question for the grade 10s. Does any grade 10 want to come up here and answer this question? Because unfortunately, I'm not going to be here next year. So I know if I was returning, I would 100% do this again. But we have Cedar Lopatecki, who made that beautiful sign that we want to put out Winter Cove one day. And he is here to answer this question.
Hi, I think it would be totally great to continue looking at these areas and doing a bit more research into rockfish. And I think it's a really important thing to continue doing and gather a bit more information on.
Thank you so much. And I'm aware that that Simries has some plans to continue this project into 2021 and beyond, potentially, with the cameras that we have. Another question that came up was Michael Strong asked, are there similar conservation efforts in the United States, Jeff? Are the Gulf Islands rockfish breeding grounds for such? Jeff, do you have any thoughts about the...
There were some nearshore closures in the South Gulf Islands, and they produced a map, and storekeepers started hiding it because people came in saying, do you have the map for the hot spots? And there were people using them as maps for poaching. And actually the DFO map book for RCAs was initially being used as the guidebook for poachers. And so that's been a real problem. DFO enforcement has had to do a lot of boat seizures. They're in southern Hood Canal, there's a closure where the property owner gets out on his deck and screams at people and reports them. So sometimes you have to have special people who will look after a place, and your students are a good example.
Thanks for that answer, Jeff. Megan Hanley asked, hello, I'm curious if rockfish as a species are relatively stationary within their habitats, or do they travel outside of their conservation areas within their lifetimes? How did the DFO decide on the size and location of the conservation areas? Jeff, do you have any inside information or thoughts about how that may have been decided?
Well, actually, the tiny little Passage Island RCA, the sport guide's called Jeff's RCA because I showed that there were 300 times more broodstock quillbacks in that spot than in the one on Bowen Island. So they rescinded the Bowen Island one. And the DFO model agrees and says, and so that's why the Howe Sound RCAs, except for the one by the Paisley Island group, are all considered to be too small. That being said, that little population of stunted coppers that are using the boulder pile on Northwest Boyer, in 13 years, they don't move at all. And so in Puget Sound, on high relief, high quality habitat, rockfish will live their entire life. But with low relief and low quality habitat, they'll move considerably, especially in Puget Sound where it's shallow and the kelp beds die off. They'll leave the kelp bed areas and move into deeper water for the winter. So that's why they want to make them bigger, and they want inputs on that. The big one on the south side of Saturna, that's what DFO wants to see, big ones. You move toward Victoria, Portland Island, take a close look at the map of Portland Island. It's kind of a joke. Not even a baby rockfish would hang around such shallow water. Cadborough Bay also has a tiny spot. So some of them are sort of ludicrous, like those ones near Carmelo Point and Howe Sound.
Jeff, that almost goes into another question. Marlene asks, do you know if the RCAs have been effective in restoring rockfish populations? Which I'm sure is a bit of a complex answer, but you're saying some of the smaller ones aren't as good, and some of the bigger ones probably have a larger
Well,
effect?
I'm saying actually some of the smaller ones, like the Passage Island one, those quillbacks haven't gone anywhere because they have fabulous deep piled boulders and a glass sponge reef all in this one little area. Like where we planted the black rockfish, that's a terrific spot. But I'm sure that the rockfish conservation areas will work given enough time. But the problem is for yellow eye rockfish, you have to give them many decades to have some year classes. And right now we're in a climate regime where it doesn't matter what size the RCA is, there aren't any offspring surviving in any real numbers. So we got to give them time, and we got to stop the poaching.
Thanks, Jeff. I have a question for SEEC, and the question is from Mairead. And the question is, have you any experience with reporting the observed fishing? Was there any feedback? Is there someone who could maybe talk from SEEC about what the process of reporting is, or if we've done that as a class? Looks like Solace is coming up. Thanks, Solace.
We know all about it.
So while we haven't actually reported a boat, we just today actually called up the line and asked them a couple questions on what you would need to tell them when you call. So obviously a great thing is numbers on the boats. That's really helpful, but just like the date and the time, the location, and just like a general description is really good start. And another note, they said that this line also works for anything, like if you see a hurt deer or something, or a bear. But they didn't mention that salmon, if it's something about salmon, that's DFO. It's federal, and that line is provincial. So if you're reporting something about salmon, you're supposed to call DFO.
Thank you, Solace. Just taking a look through some of the questions here. Jeff, can you see these questions too? Just out of curiosity?
No, I can't.
Okay.
Okay.
I had a question from Tom Dakin. And Tom was asking, Jeff, we hear these rockfish on the hydrophones quite often. Would there be any use in trying to assess rockfish seasonal behavior or abundance using acoustics?
Oh, that's the guy who heads Marine Archipelago in Victoria actually did his thesis on that, and you might want to ask him. But quillbacks and coppers duke it out vocally, and it partly depends on what's going on. Like if you chase a copper rockfish in the vicinity of a quillback's den, quillback wins hands down, and there's apparently a lot of sound. We can't hear it as divers, but I'm not sure what it would be very hard to interpret, because you have to know if there are harbor seals down there harassing the fish, or what's going on. Why are they making sounds? And I can't answer that.
Thanks for
something. Tom Dakin is an acoustics expert, so he manages our Simrez hydrophones. So he has said that they can detect rockfish on the hydrophones that are here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any Jeff follows up with, or Tom follows up with, are there any hypotheses about why young do not survive except for certain years?
Oh boy, are there. There was a guy named Alan Longhurst who was the head of the Dartmouth DFO lab. He was the head of Scripps Institute of Oceanography. He wound up with FAO Rome, And after his retirement in his 80s, in 2008, he published an article called The Myth of Sustainability. And with, a cougar, deer, blades of grass, there's not a huge difference in body size between the plant and the game animal and the predator. Whereas with bluefin tuna, you have these enormous fish and their larvae are really tiny. And so he said, basically, there's no such thing as a harvestable surplus. It's all overfishing because they have to create their own trophic pyramid. And I was excited by that. And I kept in the laboratory trying to feed baby rockfish to older rockfish. And I finally succeeded once. We had a black rockfish give birth when we had China rockfish that were actually little pelagic juveniles, and they recognized the newborn blacks as food. And it's axiomatic that there's nothing that's better food for a fish than a fish. And so the year class strength, like the 1917 yellow eye year class, probably was based on terrific crustacean zooplankton productivity from the time of the very first parturition, which would be probably the oldest female. And as they grew bigger and subsequent females gave birth and the young were surviving well, the biggest ones just cannibalized the later stages and sailed right through, eating bigger and bigger fish larvae. And that's exactly what happened with our black rockfish and our Chinas. Every single one of the Chinas survived. And they were in real duress from starvation at the time. So and that's been noted in Japan in aquaculture. Cannibalism is really important. This was seen with mackerel in the Atlantic over a century ago, that the really healthy mackerel larvae had mackerel in their bellies. So for rockfish, which have a big mouth and can eat well, basically they have to be big enough, like the size of your pinky fingernail, that they have all their fin raised, all their skeletal structure and everything. And at that size, a newborn with a nice, beautiful yolk sac and an oil droplet is perfect for consumption and will fill the belly, and they'll just grow explosively as they gobble down the earlier born ones. So it has to do with the timing of the diatom bloom, and it's the brown water you want to see. It's the crustacean zooplankton, not the dinoflagellates and not red tide organisms. So there's a lot we don't know about the timing of the blooms, but a long, long period of brown water probably means a good chance for a year class with rockfish.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a really comprehensive answer. I was just curious, there's another question here from Ralph Carter on the other end of the spectrum. If we're talking about kind of trophic levels and predation, what makes these fish so safe from predators when mature? He says long lifespan implies high self-repair and low extrinsic mortality. So what makes them safe from predators?
The name rockfish comes from the fact that rockfish love rock piles. And I won't tell anyone where there is a mature yellow eye broodstock hiding in a very deep boulder pile. If they got a boulder pile, they were within what's called a C-start, meaning a spinal reflex, split second, and they're underground, and their predator can't get at them. And that would have to be like a dolphin or a killer whale or a big sea lion for an adult rockfish. Those little copper rockfish hiding in the boulders on Boyer Island have harbor seals around all summer, and the harbor seals can never get them because split second, they're underground in the rock pile. So lingcod do pretty well at eating rockfish. But the lingcod can't go down into the rock pile. So it's the ability to hide. They have spines. The spines, you be warned, the dorsal spines are toxic. They have a poison gland in them. So that's another deterrent that they have. And rough eye and short raker and all have head spines. The head spines can make a head bite on some of these rockfish species is a pretty rough experience. So they're very heavily boned. They hide well, and the ones that have lived to 200 years are down so deep that I don't know what's down there that can eat them.
Thanks, Jeff. There's a question up here from a few people, Priscilla and Richard, around kind of commercial fishing of rockfish catch now. Is it limited? Priscilla's asking about the Gulf Islands and hook and line in the Gulf Islands, or perhaps your experience from the Howe Sound. Do you notice, say, the impact of sport fishers or trawlers, or any piece around the kind of the commercial rockfish catch now and what's happening?
In Howe Sound and Burrard Inlet, it is illegal to take a lingcod or a rockfish anywhere by any gear. So they're completely closed, which is an embarrassment for the Rockfish Conservation Areas, isn't it? And it's one problem with downrigger fishing, because the downriggers, the flashers, are attractive to some rockfish. I actually had a sport guide come up to me and say, "Can you help us with this rockfish?" He didn't even know what it was. He thought it was a canary rockfish. It was a juvenile yellow eye, and it was up shallow enough, schooling off bottom, that he got it with a flasher in mid-water, which is great news because it means that there was some good survival. That was back in the millennial climate regime decade. But really, it's sport troll is the only legal fishing anywhere. Long line fishing, you'd have to ask DFO. Off the West Coast, between yellow eye rockfish and halibut, you have to be using your quota for catching the one or the other, and that gets very technical. And of course, this David Suzuki Foundation has negotiated recently for the bottom trawl industry to actually contract the footprint of their trawling on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They've made it smaller.
Thanks, Jeff. I think if there's any other questions, maybe type them in now. And there's two out here that are kind of seeing on the radar. The two questions that I'm just kind of seeing here are, I'll just give them both to you, Jeff. One's about habitat and glass sponge reefs, and the other one's about First Nations and involvement in conservation. So the first question is, do you have any experience with First Nations being involved in conservation of RCAs?
We took a young Squamish Nation diver on a tour of this inshore Defense Island glass sponge reef so that he could bear witness to his elders, because the East Defense Island is actually very sacred to the Squamish Nation. It is where they fought off the Haida slavers. And it's also, unfortunately, where people in Vancouver took the burials from Dead Men's Island off Stanley Park and dumped them on Defense Island. So it is a very sacred island to them, and they want to manage these glass sponge reefs. They want to be involved.
Thanks, Jeff. And the final question that I'm seeing here is, do you think that sponge reefs provide a similar effective habitat of the rock piles that you're speaking of earlier in terms of maybe defense?
Well, they're both good habitats for broodstock rockfish. One thing I'd like to mention is that lingcod often make unfortunate choices where they spawn, and on a rock pile reef, if a lingcod puts its egg mass between two big rocks, it acts like a venturi. The tidal currents are forced between the rocks and they flow through the egg mass, giving all the embryos good aeration. They get a lot of oxygen exchange. The sponge reef looks really complex, and so the lingcod go in, they spawn there. Every single lingcod egg mass spawned in a sponge reef dies, because think about it. The egg mass is between these cloud sponges that are pumping water inside to filter out bacteria. They're actually robbing the egg mass of water flow. And it's just a mistake. They're winners and losers.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciated all your answers to those questions. And I also wanted to just turn my gaze towards the SEEC class over here and say thank you very much for your presentation, and also extend a great thank you to all of our viewers here who chose to spend their Thursday night or their Tuesday night at 7 o'clock to learn a little bit more about an important species in our local Salish Sea. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming out for a little bit of learning with us tonight. Thanks for Simris for putting on these talks, and I look forward to the next talk, which I believe is in May, and I believe our speaker will be Daniel Pauly, who's a renowned scientist out of UBC, I believe talking about demographics and fish stocks in general and global fishing. So I'm really looking forward to attending that one and being in the audience with you. So thanks again, Simris, thanks SeaTalks, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, SEEC, for being a part of it.
Thank you, Martin.
Have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Thanks for tuning in.